Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Isaac Butler. Isaac, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. My name is Isaac Butler, and I'm a bunch of different things. I'm a writer, I'm a theater director, and I am currently the co-host of Slate.com's podcast Working, which is interviews with creative people about their jobs and the creative process.
Thank you for coming on. I'm a big fan of your work. And I'm excited to talk about our topic today, which is Hamilton. We'll also be touching on Hamilton's connections to Shakespeare, which you wrote a piece about 4 years ago.
Ill-timed from a readership perspective.
Yeah, so we'll link
close
to this piece.
reading of Hamilton's politics that is published like the day Trump wins the election.
Yeah, I think I noticed that too. I think that it was published November 7th, 2016. So I missed this the first time this piece came out for possibly many reasons, but when I reread it again, that's what really made me want to talk to you about Hamilton, which I'm a big fan of, and you're a big fan of. And you're also, we should note, you hosted a limited run podcast called Lend Me Your Ears that is about Shakespeare and politics that is very good, and we'll link to that as well. And I encourage people to check that out. I'm sure it's still every bit as relevant. It came out about 18 months ago.
I just listened to one of the episodes recently because the Public Theater is doing this audio play version of Richard II, and we did an episode of Lend Me Your Ears about Richard II. I was like, let me just listen to this again. And I was like, hey, I'm actually pretty proud of this. It's not every day that you create something and a couple years later you still feel good about it. So.
Yes, it doesn't surprise me that has stood the test of some length of time, although it feels like a totally different world. 18 months ago when that came out. But so let's start with Hamilton. So probably most people know the reason everyone is talking about Hamilton once again is that a filmed version of the stage production starring the original cast, which was filmed in 2016, and they held on to it for 4 years, was released on Disney Plus. And so people kind of dove back into the Hamilton discourse that went, captured the internet's attention, 4.5 years ago. As you said, you wrote this piece about Henry IV Part 1, comparing it to Hamilton. And so I just wanted to bring you on and we'll talk about the play. And one of the things I saw you tweeting about that really made me want to talk to you was you tweeted about how you had a sense of exhaustion with the discourse around Hamilton, how it was so obsessed with political interpretations of the play, what the play got wrong or ignored, and why it's good or bad, capital G, capital B, in terms of furthering the pursuit of social justice or something. And not enough people were just talking about it and analyzing it as a great work of art, which is what it is. So I hope we're mainly going to stick towards that end of things and not the various political readings that that the play has gotten.
Yeah, I should say, to caveat my own rant there, that, it's great when there's a great work of art that blows up big and is super popular, and then people want to talk about it in its cultural context, and that makes complete sense to me. I just felt like it was unbalanced. That conversation was drowning out a conversation about what the show actually is, what it means, what it says, what questions it's asking, what are its themes, because it became all about is this show Obama? That was sort of how does this relate to the Obama legacy? But there's more stuff going on in that play than kind of Obama or Trump, I feel like. Yeah,
and speaking of, things standing the test of time, of course, we'll never know. But I feel like in 50 years and 100 years, if people are still around, they will still be paying attention to Hamilton and interpreting it and reinterpreting it and listening to the original cast recording.
I think so for sure. I mean, I sort of felt like the show's moment had completely passed when Trump was elected. And in fact, I said this somewhere else. I not on purpose, but realized a few months later that the day Trump won the election was the last time I listened to the original cast recording.
Oh, that's interesting.
For a very long time, actually. And so I went into watching the filmed version with a certain amount of suspicion, a certain amount of, this is going to really hurt to watch this thing. Mm-hmm. And what I found instead was I fell in love with the show all over again. And I've been listening to the original cast recording since, and I've had those songs in my head and everything like that. I think it certainly reads differently now. All art reads differently as the culture in which you read it, or the context, I should say, in which you read it changes. But it was still great.
So did you see the original production either at the Public Theater or on Broadway with the original cast?
I am not so insufferable that I saw it with the original cast of the Public, but I am just insufferable enough that I saw it with the original Broadway cast.
Okay, so that's great. So you saw you saw it in its original conception by Lin-Manuel Miranda. I saw it only last summer on Broadway, and I don't think anyone from maybe some of the backup dancers or something were the same, but all the major cast members had switched one or more times, and so. That was my experience. Oh, I have a little visual gag here. I forgot, which is I'm wearing my
nice.
my Rise Up shirt, which shows what a super fan of Hamilton I am, and that I can't
amazing.
be very neutral in praising this work. But anyway, okay,
I should have been drinking out of my commemorative Hamilton cup, because for those of you watching this who don't know, when you go to Broadway, when you buy booze, it now comes in a commemorative plastic cup, and then you can get cheaper refills if you bring that cup to the to buy more booze. So you just end up with this collection of novelty plasticware that clogs your kitchen up. But yes, so I should have joined you in that.
Okay, so here was one of my initial thoughts when I saw it on Broadway. So I fell in love with the soundtrack when I got it early in 2016 and was like, medium level obsessed with the play for a long time. I didn't stop listening to it as you did. On car trips, I would listen to the entire run through. And then when I finally saw it live, it was a very emotional experience for me. And basically throughout the entire first half or the entire first act, like I just found myself like weeping throughout almost every song. And I was just like overcome with emotion at this. And I'm not like an easy crier to begin with.
You had an experience of the sublime.
It was close to that, at least. And I listened, and I had the sound. Like I'm not generally a musical theater fan. I don't go to a ton of Broadway shows. I lived far away from New York City for a number of years, so this is not something I normally do. But like I heard the soundtrack so many times. I had it in my head. I could tell when they deviated, giving different interpretations or emphasis in the production a year ago. So when I watched the stage version, or when I watched the filmed version on Disney Plus, I did not have that overwhelming moment of the sublime. There were like one or two moments where I felt like a little, like my eyes, watering a little bit, or a pang of emotion. There's these sad moments in the play, people dying and stuff. But it is different. And so I was thinking, is it the times we live in, or is it just, you just can't actually capture what it's like to see a live performance, even if you have the most brilliant creators and actors involved, and they are filming it exactly as they want to. There's watching it on your TV, and then there's this. I think this was originally intended to be shown on the big screen, right before COVID.
Yeah.
So that is perhaps different, and a big screen experience is different than a small screen experience, but it just wasn't the same. It just didn't hit the same. So what did you think about that, since you actually did see the original?
Well, once it is no longer live, and once you are no longer in the room where it's happening, it loses something. That no matter what, there's just no way to make up for the actual power of presence and liveness that happens when you see a great show in person. That's one of the reasons why I've dedicated my life to the theater, is chasing that feeling and trying to create that feeling for other people. It really isn't replaceable. You can do other things that are of equal value or of different value or whatever, but that specific feeling you can't you can't replace. Just like listening to a live album isn't the same as having seen that concert, or even if it's a bootleg of the exact concert you saw. And I think actually one of the songs that I realized it the most was Wait For It. Because when Leslie Odom Jr. gets, when they get to the big bridge and he says, sings Wait For It, and the chorus repeats it. When you see it live, you actually feel those repeated wait for it's get larger and larger and larger and fill up more space, because there's more singers each time the phrase is repeated. You even get some of a sense of that on the album. There is no way to convey that. And I was watching it on a TV with a surround sound setup and everything. There's just no way to recreate that. And so, yeah, you do lose some of that stuff. What you gain is the ability to go close and pick up nuances in the performances. Because I saw it from, I had house seats, I think, so I had pretty good seats. The house seats are seats that are owned by the production that they give or sell, kind of the day of. That's a terrible explanation of them, but just so you understand that they're like nice seats that they would hold for people that I happened to win in a thing. And so, these were, good seats in the second section of the orchestra, I guess. And I certainly couldn't pick out all the details that those cameras can. I think sometimes they get seduced by that. The way the film is shot, for people who haven't seen it, is they filmed a couple of performances and then they additionally did the show without an audience and with a cameraman on stage tracking specific moments.
Yeah, I figured there must have been multiple takes because you never see a camera.
You never see a camera, and Lin-Manuel Miranda's goatee stubble changes length a couple times.
Oh, okay. So you're okay. So either you have a much better TV than I do, or you're paying very close attention.
Or I'm just staring there with the magnifying glass. Yeah. But if you've seen the film, the obvious first cut in is when Lin-Manuel Miranda appears and sings his first line, "Alexander Hamilton, my name is Alexander Hamilton." And the reason why they've done that is because that actual entrance stops the show for at least a minute of the crowd going insane. And, that just doesn't have any value. And so instead they cut to that guy. Almost every time they cut to the camera wandering on the stage, picking out details, I thought it was actually a mistake. I thought they should have shown a little more restraint and stayed with just the cameras that were on the sides, in the back, and in the front, and just kind of let more of the stage picture evolve. But what you do get through the ability to zoom and edit is little nuances and grace notes in all of the performances, which particularly when it came to Leslie Odom Jr. and Philippa Soo, I thought were totally essential to picking out what's going on in those performances. I mean, the amount of agonizing conflict that Leslie Odom Jr.'s face brings to his portrait of Burr, that he truly admires and is astounded by Hamilton, even while wanting to crush him into a fine mist, is and watching that just play out on his face is a really incredible thing to watch happen. And similarly with Philippa Soo, particularly before Eliza is introduced, she is actually on stage a few times as a kind of chorus member, ghost kind of figure.
Right.
And you can see that she is actually reacting to what's going on stage in character as Eliza in this sort of purgatorial zone. All of that I thought was really interesting, was something that you just never would have seen unless you were in maybe the first three rows of the house. Yeah,
I mean, the close-up on seeing someone's face, unless you're really close. So when I saw it, my mother very kindly and extravagantly got us seats in like the fifth row. They were best seats I'll ever have in a Broadway show.
And so those are much better seats than I had.
So we were right there, and could see the spittle flying and stuff like that. But yeah, you almost never. But even then, you don't get the kind of close-ups that you can get with a camera and a TV screen or a theater projection or something. And yeah, so there's a lot of places to go. I mean, I do wonder if my reaction would have been different if I did see it on the big screen. I've told this little anecdote before on the show, but I saw 5 or 7 years ago, I saw E.T. on the big screen. And especially the final 15 minutes of E.T., which I had seen as a child but I hadn't really seen since, are incredibly powerful. On the big screen, the music is so loud, and you're just being overcome by these waves of emotion. And there's 10 lines of dialogue in the final 15 minutes, and then E.T. leaves, and you're you can't believe it. And then the movie's over. Spoiler alert! Sorry if anyone hasn't seen E.T. Before, but yeah, it just the big screen experience is different, and it seems like we don't know when we're going to have access to that experience again because of the pandemic. So that sucks. But I do wonder if they had released this and then, just there's something about the sheer scale of the big, literal big screen and how loud it can be in the theater. You're not going to get that unless you have some crazy home sound system or something. So it's weird because, if you're seeing it on Broadway, the people, unless you have really good seats, the people are far away and somewhat small. And then when you see on the big screen, they're gigantic, larger than life, overwhelming. But both of those somehow can be more all-encompassing experiences than just sitting on your couch.
Yeah, totally. And one thing I should say is that the concern would be when you can get into close-up and stuff like that the performances would be too big. because they have to be big enough to reach someone in the back row of the balcony,
right.
You know? And I actually thought for the most part that was not the case. You know, for the most part, you just kind of go along with these are theatrical performances and it's going. And because the lyrics are so larger than life, you know, the experience of it is so larger than life, I thought it created a kind of zone where a larger than life performance would still fit in really well.
Okay, is there anything else you want to say about this particular? Well, let's talk about the. Okay, so spoiler alert if anyone doesn't know what happens at the end of Hamilton. So there's this. There was a piece on Slate about it. The very final shot or action of the musical is Eliza, the widow of Hamilton, who's been murdered in the duel by Burr, is looking towards the stage or looking towards the audience and lets out a cry that's somewhere between ecstatic and shocked or mourning or something. And so I guess this has been interpreted in various ways. And then I thought, maybe I'm misremembering this. The version that I saw last summer, I believe, did not have that same setup. It had the actress playing Eliza facing to the side, and then suddenly Hamilton was there for a second. And then it was black. So maybe I dreamed that. I need to figure out.
I don't know
if anyone else has seen that. It's also not in the cast album, that cry, the shriek or cry or something. So unless you had seen it on Broadway previously, then you hadn't gotten that part of it. So what did you think of that?
Well, I mean, I actually didn't remember that moment from when I had seen it. And I remember that production pretty well, you know. And so when Sam Adams, who's a wonderful critic, wrote that piece for Slate, I was like, oh, yeah, now I vaguely remember this happening. But I honestly never really engaged with that moment that deeply because I guess, and this is going to sound, there's no way to say this without sounding snotty. I think it's just a deliberately ambiguous ending whose point is to end the show. And it does not actually, there's not much going on with it beyond that, is kind of my feeling about it. Is that you just want to end on a moment where it feels, she's entered the afterlife and then you have this reaction that's not entirely explicable and then it ends. And so I've never really gotten into the big debates over that. On Twitter, I listed a few of my favorite, well, we have to end this show sometime. Now's the moment for the ending gestures that I've used as a director and that I've seen as an audience member. And, my favorite is when you get to sort of the last big chunk of the show, the last movement of the show, maybe it's the last scene or there's a big monologue that ends it or whatever. You slowly and imperceptibly fade the lights down from a general look to a really specific look. It kind of looks like the stage is melting. And then it gets to that really specific look and you hold on that for about 5 and then it slowly fades, right? And people are just like, oh, wow. The show is really over now. Another one is the lights get brighter and brighter and brighter while a louder and louder and louder sound effect plays, and then it snaps to a blackout. That's a good one for a kind of, the world is going to shit kind of ending. I mean, there's a lot of them in the kind of director's bag of tricks. And so I just felt like, oh, you pulled that out of that bag of tricks. I know what that is, but I also think that's a kind of catty theater person way to react to it and doesn't engage with it with the kind of depth I've told people to engage with the show. So maybe I'm a hypocrite. I don't know. I certainly don't think, I mean, if I had to explain it, if you put a gun to my head and told me to choose a meaning for it, I'd be like, well, yeah, she sees the afterlife. It's like when you die, even the most fervent believer is going to be a little surprised that they were right, that there's an afterlife, and she gets to see her husband. There's this moment of the terror of death and then the recognition of being on the other side, because this is a play that firmly asserts that there is an afterlife. There's both a afterlife in the sense of history and legacy and narrative. And then there's a second afterlife, which is actually like there is an other side. They they talk about quite a bit in the second half of the show. Yeah.
And that, so here's a possible segue. So that, the final song, the final, number of the show is Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. And it seems to take place in this liminal, space where the characters the dead characters are returning as ghosts to give one final statement about what happened during the show. I guess it's a little like Our Town. Maybe that's possible.
It's a really classic. I mean, there was another show that came out around that time that my wife and I saw, and she was like, I can't believe they went for, it was a new play. And she was like, I can't believe they went for this for the ending, which is when the people turn to the audience, and they describe the manner of their death, right? They're I lived for 30 more years until I was hit by a car.
Okay,
and then the next person, it's a classic for a reason. It works. It has a real power if you do it right, And so this has the kind of testimonials of all the presidents that came after, and then Eliza narrates the next 5 decades of her life, which were largely devoted towards building the legacy of not just Hamilton, actually, but some of the other founding fathers, because she helped raise money for the Washington Monument. Et cetera, et cetera. Right,
and then she interviewed the soldiers who served with Hamilton, apparently. I don't know if it seemed like oral history didn't really exist back then, but that must exist in some form. But then I remember especially, I don't know, there was a point where I thought that that final number is the end of Hamlet. It's Hamlet dying, and he says to her, he tells Horatio,
that these bodies high on a stage be placed to the view, right?
Well, it's telling Horatio, you can't die, you can't drink the poison, because I need someone to tell what actually happened. Yes. And so there's a lot of, so here's the segue, Shakespeare and Hamilton. There's, explicit Shakespearean references in the play, mostly to Macbeth. And then there's, comparisons that are more implicit, like, maybe there's some Hamlet in there, and you published on the day before the 2016 election, wrote this piece.
Great timing again. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Wrote this piece about Henry IV Part 1 and Hamilton, and so Henry IV Part 1 is actually my favorite Shakespeare play. So the fact that I somehow missed this piece for the past 3.5 years, I'm like kicking myself. But we'll link to it. It's an interesting piece, and I know you wrote it like 4 years ago, and we'll just talk about it a little bit.
I reread it in prep to see the movie, actually, because I was like, what did I say about this back then? So I'm pretty familiar with my arguments. I think I still believe them. Okay. We all change as human beings, but right. I think that one still represents sort of how
a lot changed in the past 3.5 years. But so that didn't change is the structure of the double in plays, and so the obvious double Hamilton and Burr in Hamilton, and then you have the double of Hotspur and Prince Hal in Henry IV Part 1. So I think what you wrote was it's interesting, like just grappling with like what is trying to be said through these characters. And okay, so why don't you just talk a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, sure. So obviously there's a lot of Shakespeare to Hamilton. Hamilton is a contemporary attempt to write a Shakespearean history play. I don't know that Lin-Manuel Miranda actually had that in his mind, but there's a number of different connections. Shakespeare was basing his history plays on a popular and somewhat not reputable historical account, Holingshed's Chronicles, and Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing the same with Ron Chernow's Hamilton, which I think lots of historians have a lot of problems with, but is a contemporary popular history of that man and his era. And then there's an attempt to kind of narrativize that to tell a story about what history is, what power is, politics, ambition, all sorts of things. We're pretty sure that Shakespeare acted in all of his plays. We don't know for sure, but he almost certainly acted in Henry IV Part 1. He would not have played Hal, but he would have acted in Henry IV Part 1.
Is there an idea? Because usually the understanding is that he played old men.
Some people, if I remember correctly, and I could have this completely wrong because I don't have my sources on the cast of those plays in front of me, but if I remember correctly, the legend, the thing we would like to believe is that he played King Henry. But there's plenty of other old men in that play. I mean, the thing is that the doubling in Henry IV does not just go to Hal and Hotspur. Hal has two competing father figures in the King and Falstaff. Hotspur has two kind of father figures in Northumberland and Westmoreland. I mean, it's all over the place. As it is in many of Shakespeare's plays, there's doubles upon doubles upon doubles, which kind of reaches its peak in Hamlet, where there's just a copy of everything. I mean, everything has its double somewhere, and so. But so Henry IV Part 1 is one of my favorite Shakespeare plays, for sure. I absolutely love it. I directed it as my senior thesis in college.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so I actually, seeing a production of Henry IV Part 1 in college was a key moment in my life in a weird way. I saw a traveling production of what was then the Shenandoah Shakespeare Company, and now has a different name, American Shakespeare Company, I think, doing Henry IV Part 1. I'd already read it in my Shakespeare histories and tragedies class, and I was kind of like, I don't, this doesn't seem that funny to me. I don't really get it. And then just the way it was just a very sort of modern speech, but clarify, speaking in a way that it clarified so much of the complex language and the production, and it was also extremely funny, and had a bit where in the famous scene where Hal and Falstaff switch personas. When the guy who was playing Falstaff became Hal, he did a Keanu Reeves voice, and everyone laughed. So it had all this goofy stuff in it. But then I was like, oh my god, I get this is as funny as anything I would see that was produced this year. And then I saw that got me really into Shakespeare, and I wrote my senior thesis on Shakespeare, and I've been a Shakespeare nerd ever since. But then sorry, I interrupted you. So you directed
I directed it as my senior thesis in college, which was probably a mistake, for a 22-year-old to try to do a 3-hour long dense Shakespeare history. But anyway, so I love that play, and I just started thinking about this kind of how the themes of ambition and what's politically possible, work in those two plays, and what Hal's rise in Henry IV Part 1 and Alexander's rise in Hamilton might have to do with each other. And obviously there's other source texts. I don't even know if Lin-Manuel Miranda was thinking about Henry IV Part 1. I mean, a much more obvious reference point for that show is Peter Shaffer's Amadeus, specifically the stage play, not just the movie, because the stage play is narrated by Salieri, and it opens with you being told that Salieri murders Amadeus, so there's lots of reference points there. But I just thought in terms of its dynamics and its themes, these two plays had a lot to say to each other, and that reading one through the other would be great, especially because I think that actually, Henry IV Part 1's critique of Hal is much more explicit in that text than Hamilton's critique of Hamilton, which I think there is a critique there in Hamilton. I think that musical is more complicated than just being a simple, hagiography. But I was struck by the idea that this playwright, writing under a very strict regime of official censorship, in London, was able to make a play that had a lot more criticisms of people in power than the Hamilton musical, and that was sort of what got me into thinking about those two shows together. And some of it also grew out of feeling like the musical of Hamilton, particularly in the second half, actually does have a critique of Hamilton in there, and that it wasn't getting paid enough attention to, and that I could kind of try to bring that out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Hal does not come off looking great after Henry IV Part 1 or Part 2. And King Henry...
Or to my mind, Henry V, but that's a very controversial position on my part.
Right, he's portrayed in a more heroic way, but he does also sentence one of his friends to be...
Bardolph!
Hanged.
Poor Bardolph. Yeah.
Yes, so, I mean, is Falstaff the moral center of Henry IV? I think I actually wrote a paper making that case, and I got a B- on it or something.
Yeah.
The King Henry IV doesn't seem like such a great guy either, and he has that famous line in the Part 2 about busy mind with foreign wars or whatever, and so it's not until you get to Henry V that there's a fairly positive portrayal of a leader, within the Henriade of plays, because Richard II was a even worse king, I guess.
Yeah, although there's this whole tension in Henry V where the chorus is telling you how great Henry is. But then if you actually just look at the events of the play and how they're portrayed, you're like, really? And particularly if you read the plays in sequence, right? Because what does King Henry tell Hal on his deathbed? But, busy the minds with a foreign war. Start a war on a bullshit pretext, to consolidate your power. And what does Hal do as soon as he's king in the very beginning of Henry V? He starts a bullshit war on pretext to consolidate his power. I mean, if you read those two plays together, I think it's really hard to see Henry V as a straightforward celebration of Hal. It's a portrait based somewhat on Machiavelli's The Prince of someone sort of brilliantly conquering everything in front of him. He conquers the church persuasively, not with violence, but he conquers the church. Then he goes and he conquers France, and then he conquers a new wife, that he charms everyone around him. He gets Wales on his side. There's that sort of what he has to do to fulfill his ambitions to conquer. And, I've been on plenty of panels where people disagree with this reading, or I was on a panel with a neocon scholar who was like, yes, Shakespeare is saying that, and he's saying that's why Hal is good, because he will do what is necessary to rule, and that's what makes him a good king. And I was like, oh, that's just as my reading is certainly revealing of me. I feel like that reading is revealing of you and your position.
Well, there were plenty of comparisons between Henry IV and Hal and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush during the George W. Bush era, and the invasion of Iraq as the parallel to the invasion of France. And
yeah, I agree to some extent with the Republicans who say that George W. Bush and Hal had a lot in common, but for the complete opposite reasons than they do, right?
Yeah, the misspent youth. And I think some people were trying to say that Cheney was Falstaff. Doesn't really make a ton of sense, aside from them both being kind of heavy. But I guess it depends on how, in part, what was the understanding of Agincourt, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and that whole military escapade in Shakespeare's time, whether this was like the greatest thing we had ever done, or whether this was seen as a waste of money. What's the point? Because they lost it all, in the subsequent years.
Right. But no matter what, it is curious that Shakespeare really goes out of his way, I feel like, with Hal to underline unsympathetic things about him. He gets one soliloquy in each play, and that he's in. He's in 3 plays, and his big soliloquy in Henry IV Part 1, which comes right after we've met him, and he has this hilarious scene with his drunken friends where they're one-upping each other in sort of dexterous verbal play, and it's just wonderfully charming. And then he says, as soon as they're all off stage, I'm using all of these people for my own political gain, because once the clouds move off the sun, we appreciate the sunshine more than if the sun had been shining the whole time, which is a pretty despicable thing to just immediately see someone say. And a lot of productions try to kind of apologize for it or make it so that he's sort of thinking it through as he's saying it, but there's nothing in the text that makes it seem that way. He really has a plan, and he is executing it brilliantly.
And herein will I imitate the sun, something like that.
Yeah.
The base contagious clouds.
The base contagious clouds, exactly. And then, when you get to Henry V at the very end of the Battle of Agincourt, what does he do? He commits a war crime. He orders all the prisoners to be killed, right? And the men, and it happens on stage. It's a stage direction. The audience is meant to see it, that the guards assassinate all the prisoners. So there's a real darkness to that portrait, in part because I think Shakespeare, could never escape a dialectic. If he ever asserted one thing, he had to assert its opposite and let them fight each other. He was just addicted to that. It's in every single play. And so I was interested in that when it comes to Hamilton, because you get back to Hamilton and, he betrays Lafayette, which is given about 5 seconds of stage time. Hamilton says, well, he's a smart man. He'll figure it out. And there certainly is no moment where the action stops and someone comes forward and is like, actually, he did not figure it out. It really sucked to be Lafayette at this moment in time, and
Yeah. So Lafayette ended, during the French Revolution, Lafayette ended up imprisoned, and he was like there for 10 years or something like that, and eventually was released, and then came back to America, exactly. I think.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not like there's the song where Lafayette is suddenly revealed and he's like singing about how much he's upset at Alexander. Nor is there a moment where, Hamilton. I'm not a historian of that time period, so I'm probably going to get this wrong. But, there's a lot of skepticism around Hamilton's abolitionist bona fides from the community of historians that I follow and read anyway. And around those claims as they are made in the show. And so there's certainly no, scene invented where someone comes to ask Hamilton to write more about slavery and he refuses to do so because there's other political things they have to get done first or, whatever. So there is, so the complexities are there, but they're kind of hidden, they're buried. And much more of the negative side of Hamilton that we see in the second act is actually personal. It's him cheating on his wife. It's that his kind of charming upstart drive in the first act becomes this kind of off-putting arrogance in the second. The actual moment when it happens in the film anyway, for me, is at the very end of the first act when he says treasury or state, when he's not even listening to what George Washington is saying. Right, because he's like, I'm going to make this demand that I run either the Treasury or the State Department. And everything about Lin-Manuel Miranda's facial expression, his physicality, everything is almost avaricious. It's that he's just so hungry for this. And of course that he gets his son killed and then dies in a duel, for these sort of petty honor disputes, which is to say for nothing, really. That's the part that's played up in the second half as opposed to the downsides of his political point of view or the downsides of his ambition or his willingness to compromise. Mm-hmm. And as I pointed out in the piece, don't mean to give you a stem winder here. You just asked a simple question. Sorry. But,
That's okay. That's okay.
As I pointed out in the piece, there's the room where it happens is this wonderful song about the kind of, oiliness of compromise, that it's necessary for politics, but it's also distasteful. But it does not point out that actually there are other problems with compromise too. Like the compromises the founding fathers entered into weren't just like distasteful or looked bad or whatever. They preserved slavery. That was their big compromise. It's in fact called the 3/5 compromise. And the show just doesn't really want to engage with that, which is fine. That's its right. But I was very interested in how often Shakespeare returned to the downsides of Hal's way of doing politics. And how, for Hamilton, the downsides of Hamilton were mostly about him as a human being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so obviously there's a lot there. I'm thinking so the first act of Hamilton is as I said before, it made me weep almost nonstop, but it's also it's almost nonstop, little key phrase from the play, nonstop, the songs just run into each other very quickly.
Yes.
And the forward momentum of the first 6 or 7 numbers is incredible. It's just it's almost like athletes performing. They're all doing so much on stage. And
that's part of the pleasure of it is how difficult what they're doing is. Watching them do these very difficult things. It is a tightrope act. When Daveed Diggs is not only speed rapping in Guns and Ships, but jumping on a table and dancing.
And in a French accent.
In a French accent. Part of it is what's going on in that moment is so great and so well written and everything. Part of it is you're just stunned that someone is pulling off something this hard.
Yeah.
That's part of the joy of it, I think. And the second act is much more it slows into something. It settles into this kind of, you really feel during Say No to This, the humidity of a New York or Washington, D.C. summer and that kind of loneliness and depression and boredom. I mean, it is a much darker, sadder experience.
Hi, so we had some technical difficulties that ended our initial recording prematurely, and so we came back a couple days later to finish this up, and that's why we look a little bit different and wearing different clothes. So the point I was making when the connection broke was that Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2 have some parallel to Act 1 and 2 of Hamilton, and Act 1 is this very kind of optimistic has like all this momentum, and then Act Two, much more tragic, things falling apart, and characters dying and so forth, and darker, and many of the characters seem much less heroic. It's not an exact parallel, but like Henry IV Part 2 I think is rarely performed as a standalone. It's sometimes performed if they do Part 1 also.
I have never seen it performed as a standalone.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of strange. I mean, in many ways, it's a retread of a lot of things that happened in the first one. There's kind of redo similar gags and stuff like that. But the famous part of it is kind of the Chimes at Midnight, the line that became the Orson Welles, the title of the Orson Welles version, is uttered by Falstaff in Part 2, and then also the kind of like banishment scene at the end where the newly crowned Henry V kicks Falstaff out. And I got my copy here. I'll just read it just very briefly because it's a great line. So Falstaff, it's like there's like a crowd scene, and Falstaff is calling out to the newly crowned king. He says, "My king, my Jove, I speak to thee, my heart." And then the king says, "I know thee not, old man, fault of thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester. I have long dreamt of such a kind of man, so surface swelled, so old and so profane. But being awake, I do despise my dream." And so this is, also goes back to what you were saying about, Hal's, from the very start, Hal has presented himself as kind of like living a double life and going to be able to use the dissoluteness of his public behavior to emphasize the changes once he becomes king. I mean, it's funny because getting back to Hamilton, I don't know, it's almost there's just so much. Like, you could almost perform Act 1 as like a standalone, and then in the end it's like they won, right. And then hooray, and then that's the end. And then everything gets like messier, and people are betraying each other and having duels against each other and dying.
Yeah, I mean, it almost feels in a weird way like you think the first act is going to end with the Battle of Yorktown and everyone saying the world turned upside down. I mean, it feels like the end of an act. Got to go to New York, got to meet my son, all that stuff. And then, there's just this like one of the few slight, almost little pauses in the play. And then King George is right there and is like, all right, what comes next? And you realize that actually there's quite a bit more of the act to go, to bridge us into the kind of harder realities and decay of the second half of the play. Or musical, I should say.
And so the final song or number of Act 1 is, bridging the period between the end of the Revolution and like the beginning of the constitutional government, and
right.
They allied the Articles of Confederation, but all the stuff that Hamilton accomplished, and it's one of the best numbers in the play just musically, and the way it ends is this kind of technique that I'm sure if there's a name for it, it's where they bring in multiple other like themes, like musical themes from other songs.
I don't know if this is the technical term. I always think of it as the recapitulation, right? Because that's everything's just coming back then, and they do that all the time. And the show that does this kind of the most either masterfully or gimmickly, cheaply, depending on how you think about the show, is Les Mis, because Les Mis only really has like 4 melodies. Like every song in Les Mis can be sung on top of every other song in Les Mis, and over and over and over again, they keep pulling that, which is why you leave Les Mis with the entire show stuck in your head, which is part of its brilliance and staying power, I suppose.
Right. So, yes, I actually learned about this in a somewhat silly way, which is they ripped it off in the South Park movie that came out.
Yeah, of course,
in 2000. And there's one particular song, I can't remember exactly what.
Tomorrow Night, which is a parody of One Day More from Les Mis. I mean, it's very, but that's not the only song Les Mis does that in. Les Mis just does that constantly. I mean, it's really remarkable how much it's like these Lego blocks that just fit together in a bunch of different combinations.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess I'll just mention this part now because it's so brilliant how it proves the brilliance of that particular song. So there's this YouTube video that started going viral last week that is called Muppet Hamilton, and we'll link to it, or you can just Google Muppet Hamilton and it'll probably come up. And it's one man. There's no visuals. It's just audio. It's one man doing the entire original cast recording in playing all the characters as the Muppets. And so Hamilton is Kermit, of course, and Eliza is Miss Piggy, and then Sam the Eagle is George Washington, and Lafayette is Fozzie, I think, and so it goes through and has lots of. And so this guy is I think he's a he's either a stand-up comedian or he does like mimicry or imitations professionally, and almost all of them are very good, except I think so. Gonzo is Burr, and I think Gonzo is a little weak. But aside from that, it's very well done. It's very funny. There's some
Gonzo's a tough voice to do. I mean,
to sing, especially to sing in the Gonzo voice. And comparing it to Leslie Odom Jr., you have someone doing this crazy Gonzo voice. It doesn't exactly work, I think. But other than that, it's mostly good. And even one of the silliest parts is that Laurens, so only Act 1 has been posted so far. He says he's going to do Act 2 later. Laurens is voiced by Beaker, and Beaker just goes like meep meep meep,
right,
or something like that.
Right.
And so all those lines are just sung by the guys going meep meep meep, and they do a similar joke for Satisfied with Angelica is one of Gonzo's chickens, and so she is just balking and
for the entire
Satisfied.
Song.
It's pretty wild. But anyway, when you got to the final song, is it called My Shot, or is that the earlier one? Whatever that final
No, the
song
final song
is
is Nonstop.
Nonstop, right?
That kid is nonstop. That
Okay.
one. Yeah.
So he has it, and all the Muppet characters are singing, and by the end of it, I was like, this sounds great. Like it really the song itself is so well constructed that even one person doing like 8 different Muppet imitations layered over each other, singing towards the end, I just like go into it, and then there's like it's like Alexander Hamilton, just you wait, and then you hear like a slight cannon fire sound or gunshot sound or something right at the very end, and then I was just. I never kind of had this experience where it's almost like it's kind of like a Weird Al, like the Weird Al parody exposes like the brilliance of the original.
Yes,
kind of
yeah. Well, that's the thing about like really bulletproof songwriting is that in a way when you mock it, you're actually just showing how great it is, right? Because the fundamentals are so strong. I mean, Weird Al, for example, almost always thinks of his parodies as a kind of tribute. I mean, he doesn't usually parody songs he dislikes. They're not really acts of vandalism. They're acts of real joy. And I think if you've ever seen the incredibly funny Weird Al behind the music, because his life is not traumatic and he didn't do a lot of drugs, so he's like playing with the behind the music format. It really was serious to him when Coolio took such great exception to his parody of Gangsta's Paradise when he did Amish Paradise, because I think he's used to this just being like essentially a tribute to songs that he loves. And I think there's definitely a similar thing there in Hamilton. I mean, if you want to make fun of Hamilton, like musical theater is very easy to make fun of. That is a barrel full of fish for you to shoot into, but the songwriting craft is really spectacular in a way that is, if you've never heard it, kind of hard to describe. Because at first you're like, so wait, it's like musical theater and 90s hip hop. It's those two things put together. But like the way that he blends them is really quite extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. So maybe this will be the final just part we'll discuss about Hamilton. So the show premiered in 2015, really hit big immediately, and carrying into 2016. The recording that we're talking about was done in the middle of 2016, and so it's 3.5 to 4 years later, and it's been remarked upon that this was like a paradigmatic work of the Obama era,
if not the.
Yeah, and because it was performed at the White House, like an early version was performed at the White House. But even absent that, the themes of racial progress seem to echo the high hopes of the Obama era. And so it's a different world now in multiple ways. Is there anything that strikes you as kind of discordant or just different in some way than it would have in mid 2016?
That is definitely that's an interesting question. I mean, I will say, as I think I said before, although it's been a couple days since we were recording this last, so forgive me if this is something I haven't said before, that the what seeing it now did to me was restore my feelings about its greatness as a incredibly well crafted work of art. And, you know, I had kind of not exactly soured on it, but not accessed it in a long time because of sort of the change in the surrounding, political atmosphere. So in a weird way, I will say I was more like, just transported into the show in a really wonderful way. I was not thinking about it in terms of Trump. There's not a lot there that really relates to me, to the experience of living, under Trump or living under this pandemic, which are two related things. Except I will say, you know, the one white character in the show, King George, who is quite literally mad. I mean, King George was quite literally mad. There's lots of cute jokes about that and references to it within the songs. But also, you know, part of how that character is portrayed is he has a very limited vocabulary of things he can do, and then he just does them over and over again. He has only one song that he sings, right, and the words keep changing, but the melody remains the same. And he's this egomaniac who cannot understand why anyone wouldn't want to be ruled by him, you know. Certainly there's some resonances there, but to our current leadership. But to me, it's like a reminder of a much more optimistic idea of what the American experiment could be. I was not in tune personally with that optimism when I originally saw it. That's not why I love the show particularly. I love the show because of its craft and the power of those performances. So it's not like I feel myself buying into it again now. But it is really nice in this moment to see a like truly brilliant, group of people of color on a Broadway stage, which we can't get to right now. There are no Broadway stages, doing this brilliant work, about the possibilities, the aspirational possibilities of what America could be capable of. That part of, just knocked into this. That part of it is really great. But also I do think, again, that the show's primary themes are really actually more about ambition than about the nature of this country. And so, they play out within the milieu of the nature of this country, but the show's really about ambition. And, you know, we're in the midst of a presidential election right now. We're in the midst of watching two incredibly ambitious men are going to go at it to see who gets to rule the country. And so those sorts of themes will be ever present, will always be with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can imagine some, you know, if 50 years from now this is reinterpreted by some other group of performers, you can imagine, you know, King George is styled like Trump or something, or
yes,
what people remember of Trump 50 years from now, if we're all still around. In 50 years,
do you know the play Mr. Burns by Anne Washburn?
It's a weird kind of Simpsons?
Yeah, this is a play. I highly recommend you and anyone watching this read it, because what it's about is the apocalypse happens, and it takes place, each of its three acts take place sort of further and further post the apocalypse, right? And so we lose all energy. I mean, it's a plague, and then power plants go out, and et cetera, and so forth. And what remains of our culture is what people remember about The Simpsons. And so I'm sort of imagining, 50 years from now, our society's fallen. What do they remember about Trump? Well, it's just a blonde-haired, villain with tiny hands or something. That's the Mr. Burns version of it. So in each act, there's a reenactment of the Cape Fear episode of The Simpsons that gets further and further away from what the actual episode is.
Okay. I've heard of this, but I've never seen it. It does sound fascinating. Kind of like Canticle for Leibowitz, the science fiction novel.
Yeah, yes, and I'm sure Anne Washburn read that and is a fan of that book, would be my guess. But yes, it's like the Canticle of Leibowitz happens to The Simpsons. So I'm trying to imagine that happens to Trump and Hamilton, and they sort of get combined into some horrible monster.
Right. It's funny to think, how do Americans today remember Henry IV, the human being? Probably not at all. They just remember whatever we've gotten from Shakespeare, who of
Yeah.
course was using someone else's chronicle history, and so there's so many layers of interpretation and like possible distortion and meaning to who we remember this historical personage to actually be. Okay, well, I think the kind of like parts of the play have become kind of like totems, and particularly the immigrants who get the job done line, which started getting, maybe it did before, but especially when Trump started ramping up the anti-immigrant rhetoric, started getting like long applause breaks during when the characters say it, such that people are clapping right in the middle of a movement of a number for like 30 seconds or something, and there's a couple other kind of parts of that, but I think I don't know. So currently Broadway is closed. Probably won't be open until next year or something. We don't know. You can't see Hamilton right now, but I would encourage people, if they're unfamiliar with it, check out the Disney Plus version if they have Disney Plus or have access to Disney Plus somehow. And I guess I'm guessing you would agree with that.
I think it's absolutely worth seeing. Yes. I mean, I love this musical. I love these performances. I have certain reservations about, the production, just being a director myself. I have other ways that I would have done things. That's part of, what it's about. But absolutely, but absolutely it's worth seeing and checking out, and you'll have a good time.
Yeah. And is there a Henry IV that you would recommend that is out there? There's Chimes at Midnight. I don't know if that's on streaming anywhere.
Chimes at Midnight can be really hard to find, if I remember correctly, although it's wonderful and also nuts. I mean, most of the dialogue is re-recorded in post. Right. So like nothing ever syncs up with anything. It's a mess, but a brilliant mess. The Hollow Crown movies are very good. The production values are really solid. It's great performers like Jeremy Irons, Ben Wishaw's and Richard II, and things like that. So they're wonderful, wonderful, wonderful performances. They're a little solemn, as we said earlier in this episode. I think there's a certain like British seriousness that actually the material doesn't warrant, and I wish they were more anarchic and fun, but that's definitely a great way to experience those plays.
Yeah, they don't play up the humor in the way that one could, but if you've never seen it before, it gives you a good taste. Okay, so thank you, Isaac, for persevering through various technical and chronological problems, coming back to finish this up with us.
Well, what your audience doesn't know is that this part was actually recorded earlier. We've actually gone back in time using a time machine to record for some reason. We've now screwed up the continuity of this universe.
Okay, well, I will snap my fingers and we will all dissipate into dust, as in another popular fictional series. Okay, so Isaac, you're on Twitter. Is it just Isaac Butler?
No, it's actually at Parabasis.
Oh, right.
Parabasis.
Okay.
But you can also check out the 2 podcasts I've done at slate.com/Shakespeare for my Shakespeare and politics related one, or the one I currently co-host, which is Working at slate.com/working.
Great, and I highly recommend that Shakespeare one, which is about 6 or so episodes, each one on a different play, and is very interesting. And maybe I'll re-listen to it sometime soon.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Isaac, and thanks to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.